I'd like to thank all four of you enormously. This is really awkward, actually. It's like a flower. I can't talk about responsibility and accountability while holding that thing. I'm sorry. And apologies for the closeness, the intimacy with which we've produced the stage, but I hope that leads to an interesting discussion as well, if not an intimate one. I think both of us were, and I hope the whole room was, in a sense, bombarded by so many different angles, so many different positions. But I think it's useful, and has been incredibly useful, to try to get to grips with the nature of the changes, or in some senses perhaps the lack of changes as well, in the last 20 years, that in many ways we conveniently hang around the moment of 1989. That these changes No, really, it's fine. I'm making a fuss about nothing. That's good. That's better. Does that still work? I can lean in here. That's awkward. This wasn't meant to be a comedy hour, this. I'm sorry, this has become... I think that moving swiftly along, I would like, in order to get out of my embarrassment, to ask anybody to... I would like to throw it open as much as possible to the floor. I will fill in at any points that there are gaps, but I would be much rather, Kina and Maria as well, to see if we can start at this point to have some kind of discussion with all of you who've stayed for the whole day and haven't had an opportunity to voice your concerns or your thoughts. So please, if somebody would like to start, can they raise their hand? And there are microphones on both sides of the room. Always a daunting task, even for such an august body. Yes, there's a question at the back. Can somebody, Olga, get the microphone for you? Yes, somebody's coming from this side.
Thanks a lot. I know that the conference is called Former West, but I will be insistent on the missing part of or taken to obviously...
Could you just introduce yourself? Sorry, because not everybody...
Yes, Olga Brukhovetsky. I'm coming from Kiev and represent the Visual Culture Center there. And so now you know why I'm insisting on a former East problem, I would say. And and I would just would like to point just a few very elementary questions that, as a kind of impressions from today, very interesting discussions. One is the former East, with emphasis on East, which is, of course, very reminiscent of the problem of Orientalism. Yeah, because what are we talking when we are talking about East? First of all, we have former socialist bloc countries, and this is totally relevant to the date that 1989 represents for these countries. But then there is, of course, there is China, which I do not know much about, unfortunately. And then there is a former Soviet Union, which somehow present, but not really present in this situation, because the date for Soviet Union is 1991, when it became former. And so I would like to draw your attention that we have to really differentiate this, at least two, and of course there is China, which is even more complicated thing, at least these two systems, and say former East European countries, which are now part of European Union, and former Soviet Union, which is below the visa line, as this great expression was used today. I'm not counting Baltic countries. So there is no former East as a general situation. There are many different Easts. What you might ask, what is common to this East? And there was a tendency to say that, well, it's a communist East. And communist East, it was East when it was not former East, yeah? But then there is another very elementary and simple question. What do we mean by saying communist East? Are we talking about social formation, about the theory that stays behind it, or we are talking about the ruling of Communist Party? And this is very, very simple question, but which needs to be clarified. And obviously these are not the same things. And as another suggestion, I'm finishing, I know it's not a question, but probably you can start discussing it as a good beginning for discussion. As a suggestion, of course, the 9th of November and fall of Berlin Wall, but there is also 7th of November and October Revolution, and we probably should mention this historical fact that needs a lot of explanation still, and probably right now, immediately. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Olga. I propose that we maybe gather 2 or 3 questions, and then we can respond to them. So now that Olga has broken the ice wonderfully, there's another question at the back. I'll take 2 or 3 and then turn it back to the panel.
Hello, I'm Fiona Tan. Don't know if I should say any more than that. I have a question which is maybe terribly naive, so if you want to cut off my head, okay. I noticed, really interesting afternoon, thank you all. I noticed that I started thinking about something which I would like to ask you, and is ideology, so certain ideas, predominant way of looking at the world, is that so strongly linked to economical structures? Is capitalism, I find that it's almost like such a depressing idea that the way we think has to be so ruled by the economy. I would hope that it isn't like that, but I would like to hear your response.
I'm going to ask Boris to respond to that, but I'll give him a chance to prepare it. Sorry, Helmut, can you wait for the microphone? Sorry, because we're going also out live on the internet. Can somebody pass the microphone to Helmut here? Thank you. We're going out live on the internet, which is why this laborious process of having the microphone is necessary.
Does it work? Yeah. Okay. I'm Helmut Draxler, and I have a question for Paul Gilroy. I liked your lecture very much as far as I could understand it, and so my question relates a little bit only to explain it a little bit more in detail. I thought it was extremely interesting, your beginning to question the function of a conference like this, and to see it in a relation if we are more or less part of a problem or of a solution in old leftist terms, and to draw a line to the context of war and culture as a battlefield or something like that. And in the end, and I had problems to follow you, it was a little bit fast, and in the end you came up with a reading of Fanon and the whole revolutionary tradition, and for me it was very unclear if this reference to Fanon is for you just a taking up of this revolutionary rhetorics, or if you also want to historicize that, and what would be the point of connection to other positions like that of the entanglement, and were always coming out of post-colonial theory of being always entangled in one way or another, and this revolution more or less were the outcome of that, and how could we relate that to this question? More or less, is the problem the post-West, or is it the anti-West in a certain way of, totally making an end with all of it?
Well, could I ask you would you like to respond immediately to that, and then we can work backwards through the questions? Would that be fair?
If that's what you'd like. I mean, I don't think there's a former West around. I'm sure many of us don't. I don't think that our event today was an affirmation of that transformation. I didn't approach it that way, but it seemed important, and I take here Renata's point about denial, to acknowledge the way in which the struggle against communism has been recast by many of the same ideologues as a struggle with Islam, and to acknowledge the fact that we are at war, and that this is a particular kind of war which has implications for the way in which those of us who work with and against and within cultural practices and institutions of various sorts think about what we do, and that is cut in a deep and significant way by questions of technology and by what I tried to sum up in the distinction between theories that were based on the relationship between power and knowledge, and theories that were based on the relationship between power and ignorance. And I think that that's a helpful way of understanding that change. With regard to Fanon and the revolutionary tradition, I suppose I was trying to suggest that actually there were things to learn about the wars that we are in and which we are part of, whether we like it or not. And I'm a little disappointed not to have heard more today about the fact that we meet in the context of a war. That's why I put up the slide, which showed all of us, whatever nations we're from in this emergent West, or this reborn, this resurgent West, that there is a neo-colonial West as well as a post-colonial West that we have to think about. And yes, I'm sorry if my remarks about Fanon were compressed in my haste to get to the end of what I wanted to say, but I do feel that there are things to learn from him. We speak of him as assimilated to a revolutionary tradition. I mean, as far as I understand it, that's not a communist tradition, actually. It's a different kind of revolutionary tradition, and its relationship to the communist tradition is a vexed one. In Fanon's own writing, he speaks of Marxian notions, and this goes to the other question, the middle question a little bit, that when it comes to questions of colonial history and society, Marxist analysis always have to be stretched. He speaks of it in that way. So I don't want to assimilate Fanon into some sort of prepared chair for him in the context of a left or a communist tradition where he doesn't really belong or fit. Actually, I think his lineage is in dialogue with some of those positions, but it's not where he's from, and certainly I'm old enough, well, I don't like to remember this, perhaps this is where I also fall victim to the mechanisms of denial, to a point where Marxists used to hate Fanon and despise the theory of revolutionary agency that was articulated by himself and by one or two other voices from that vintage that he was in dialogue with. And their view of culture, their view of nationality, their sense of where the national state cut or didn't enter into the development or the unfolding of a revolutionary struggle, which was a transnational as well as an international phenomenon, are all quite particular and all quite in conflict with that. So I wanted to recover some of those things, and I think people still read him, although he's become a sort of anodyne presence in the world of sort of academic theorizing in some way, as though he was a sort of he wasn't a psychiatrist, and I think that that's an important thing to remember as well. That he was a psychiatrist, and before he was a psychiatrist, he was a doctor, and that for me, I read his sense of the costs of and the necessity of violence through his role as a doctor, and I also highlighted his history of serving as a soldier in wars within Europe as an important marker, because it seems that his political morality comes out of the attempt to generalize that gesture of legitimate warfare. So that's what he was doing in my talk, and that's why I feel that he was an ending. And I think that without wanting to offend anybody, there's a terrible danger when we meet in contexts like this and we don't acknowledge what we might call the NATO dimension or the ISAF dimension of the West in our former West. And I had a feeling, tentatively, that there wouldn't be so much on that frequency in our conversation. So I wanted, perhaps grossly and vulgarly, to compensate for that by drawing our attention to it in a sharp manner. So that's what was in my mind. Does the economy connect? I think the problem is that for people like us, we're trying to understand those relationships. That's what we do. And it is depressing, yes. And actually, I think it's only fascism that doesn't allow us the right to be depressed. Actually, I think I'm rather in favour of depression in some respects, as long as it's not, paralysing.
Boris, would you like to come back onto the economy and the economy equals ideology question?
Well, first of all, about the question about former East and contemporary East, I would say if you could see, and we have spoken about one East, and now we're speaking about many East, that is precisely the change. So that's a change. And now about being communist or non-communist. So of course, during the Cold War, the East European countries, including Soviet Union, including China, were ruled by Communist Party. And this Communist Party realized at least one basic requirement of being communist, that's abolition of private property. So we should not forget that happened, and that was the reality. Everything else is everything else. So the question how it was done and so on and so on. But it was a fundamental requirement. You can see that in Plato's state and so on and so on. And that was realized. So in a certain way, it is legitimate to speak about this system as a communist system. Now, relationship ideology to economy. Of course, every ideology has not it's not immediate reaction to an economic situation of the time in which it's functioning. So every ideology has a very long tradition, long heritage, long genealogy. So it cannot be reduced to its actual shape. But its actual shape is very much dictated by economical context and political context in which this ideology actually functioning. So if you look at the same ideology or related ideologies to the many ages through the history, we see this change. And I think that this economical and political context in which ideology is working is very much influenced and shapes this ideology itself. And maybe the last remark, it is a remark you said. Yeah, I think it's very important point that you made about this new problem with political Islam, and that the kind of struggle against political Islam remobilize the notion of the West and remobilize the West and kind of effectuate kind of return to the identities from the Cold War. And I would suggest that even in a more radical form, unfortunately, because in the period of Cold War, you could not speak really honestly about communists as others for the European culture, because it was absolutely obvious, yeah, that communism has the same roots than a Western Enlightenment, comes out of the same Hegelian and Marxist and economist tradition. So communism was an enemy, but it was an enemy within, and it was an option for the West itself, a feasible option, and coming out of the heart of the Western modern civilization. And Islam, which is actually also, if you look at that more attentively, intimately connected to the history of the West, and it is a part of this history, it's easy to show, is not casted in this way. So there is a possibility and illusion that we have to do with something that comes completely from the outside, and that gives a possibility to mobilize feelings, aggressions, and resentments that are much more unfortunate, I would say, and much more unpleasant, even if we compare what happens today with the Cold War. So in this sense, I think the situation is in a certain way even worse.
Further questions? Yes, Pablo, this one here.
Thanks, I'm Pablo Lafuente. I have a question about something that has come up in the 4 presentations in very different ways, which is the idea of agency, political agency. Because I think that if the thesis of this project somehow is that 89 signifying a major change, part of this change is political change. So I think it's important to figure out who's the subject of that political change. And I think that if I can make a very simplified, summary of what each of your positions were, I think that you talked about at the end of your lecture, this idea of a spontaneous mass change that could be identified with some kind of like a Rancière type of Maoist political subject. It's quite different from the Fanon subject is very different from the Kosyev individual subject, which is subjective reading of Hegelian, and it's very different from this idea of anti-politics and an idea of civic enthusiasm that you are talking about. And I think that if you look at 89, I mean, you can think, last week 3 guys met in Berlin who were supposed to be the agents of this change. Call, and is that the change? I would like to think not. I mean, for me, it's more interesting to think of Gdansk as a model for that political subject. But I think that I want to throw it as a provocation and maybe make you argue among yourselves about these models of political change, or these models of subject. How do you see that happening there? And how do you see that happening maybe after 89? Because I guess that maybe if 89 came through by means of these political subjects, then maybe that defines what kind of political subject we can have today.
I'm going to hold it there, and if we can also think about that for a moment and collect 2 more questions while we are. There's Ekaterina at the back. Okay. And you were next, and Okwi's next round.
I have the impression today that the East still functions as a kind of utopian horizon for this self-definition of former West. Because in what Sarat Maharaj said, I actually could hear that the ideas of Václav Havel play the same role of utopian horizons as the ideals of Lenin and consecutively Trotsky and Stalin actually played for the West as something unrealized but still which we hope for, and Gorbachev too. And the project, Maria, if I remember well, you were describing the project of Что делать group, where they are what could have happened after perestroika, and for example, Soviet Union could have become a federal state with republics which were able to live. This could not happen because it was already the case. That was the problem. So it was already the case from the beginning of Soviet Union, and which finally happened. So that this all utopian horizons, actually, they don't work because it was the case in some way. But my question is, also I'm contributing to this utopian thinking of the East in this frame, and my question would be to Renata in the first place, and maybe to Boris. Renata, you were brilliantly describing how this belief and disbelief in communism was parallel to is parallel to disbelief in capitalism. And so you brilliantly demonstrated these parallels. But my question would be, why actually this disbelief in capitalism I think is much less productive than disbelief in communism, because the whole sphere of unofficial culture which existed in Soviet Union and Yugoslavia and many countries of former Soviet bloc, which produced brilliant examples of culture of and intellectual work of disbelief. But this doesn't work that well with capitalism, and irony and sarcasm are somehow helpless against it. So my question would be why it's that much difficult, and what this West could learn from this former East. And then, Marion, if we could have you next, and then we'll go back to the panel. And remember the question of political agency and subject. Can we bring it here, forward to the second row?
I would like to come back to denial and choice. First about denial, I think I have a problem with the denial of social struggles that really changed from 89 to now. And they were absolutely successful struggles. There were new actors appearing. And actually the sans-papiers movement was so influential for so many thinkers and for so many artists, and I think that has to be embedded in this kind of imaginary maps of other perspectives and other actors and other speaks positions. This has also to do with choice. I mean, in terms of choice, I have always a slight problem if you talk about, this construction of ideology. I mean, who is we in this? Who can have these choices? I think in terms of the change in the political or in the laws that we see, we can see a big shift. On the one hand, also that laws that have been quite liberal got to be very, very, strict and conservative, even that people were criminalized, like abortion laws were absolutely tightened, and it also had an influence on the West. So there, the border and migration regime changed. And what is also missing for me in the discussion today is the change of statehood and governance, these kind of new forms of governance, which also now gives us a chance to establish new forms of struggles and forms of resistance because of the supranational agents and because of the national agents and because of the NGOs and all these kind of other actors like migrants. I think Sarat pointed out also this kind of suitcase economies, this kind of smuggling, this kind of subversive strategies, but they are all in complicity. And I think that's a point. This is a shift in governance, but because of this shift in governance, because they correspond on the one hand, but on the other, there's also a split and a rupture always in between them. There's a possibility for different forms of political interventions, and I think it's very new for us, and we have to learn about that as well. Well, I'm just making a remark because it was quite obvious that this was not highlighted.
But I think it's a helpful remark,
yeah.
Marion, if I can sort of turn it into a question, because I think all three questions revolve, in a sense, around this question of agency, which Pablo brought up. I think it's the question of what kind of agency do we have in this period after '89, and I'd like to turn first to Renate, if I could, because in this condition of anxiety and this condition of shame that you talked about, can you foresee any kind of political agency, or can you marry that with the kind of social struggles post-89, which did have some success, which we had certainly in the sans-papiers movement or something like that? Do you see that there's a relation between those two, or does anxiety and shame produce any kind of political agency at all?
I'm not so optimistic, I think that Paul was right, we are living at times of constant, war and endless invention of new danger, which is an ideological operation which very much relies on anxiety. Anxiety has to be constantly reproduced in regard to the idea where does danger come from, and Islam has been now quite some time with us, at the moment now another paranoia emerged pretty globally. It's this swine flu, which opens a huge space for paranoia, and lots of fantasies about who is the danger. I just recently heard, especially about Ukraine, that they closed borders inside between the West Ukraine, which is supposedly spreading virus to the rest because of the political battle since Yulia supporters are coming from the West, and a fantasy emerged also that one should sort of vaccinate the whole Kiev from above, from airplane, that there should be sort of like a special, security for this town. And I was amazed because almost every country now created a danger coming from a neighbor or from the inside of some group that one perceives a danger. So it's an important ideological operation. I'm not so optimistic about the agency because I think that this ideology is constantly turning critique back to us, and where I don't see, in today's times, the possibility even of trade unions to organizing themselves. It's sort of the individual who is so much responsible for all his failure, which is where I would point out, yes, migrants, it's a huge problem, and one optimism I saw, by coincidence, I read UNPD report about it, pointing how valuable it is to have opened borders. It helps migrants, it helps their families and economies where immigrants, settle. So, there is very little, fight for against strict laws in regard to migration in Europe. Climate change, behavior is another should be the agency. I will do as little and as late as I can. That's sort of the political, moment, and that's two important things for the whole of society. So I would say yes, little pockets, artists, and some definitely, on the internet and so on, the organizations. But nonetheless, I think there is deep this self-centeredness and self-critique, which is part of how ideology functions today.
So, could I ask, what kind of agency does anti-politics produce? And you touched on it, but maybe you can specify it a little bit further. How do you see the connection between a subject and a position of anti-politics as taken by Haber?
I mean, it's a difficult question, and I don't think I have any sort of total answer in any case to such a question. Not just Pablo's question, but I think I was attaching it to Fiona's point about whether ideology is always so determined and shaped by the economic kind of context in which one is living. I think agency, in at least my struggle to think about it and to connect it to very many forms of stimulus that have been given today, the Fanon thing is playing on my head at the moment, and trying to think what could it mean to read Fanon at the height of the struggle against apartheid, and to know that the struggle against apartheid was largely seen in a particular way, but then to introduce the notion of blackness into it, which would seem on the one hand obvious that it was a race struggle to some extent to overcome certain notions and ideologies of race, but on the other hand, it was also about seeing how the whole apartheid system was part of a world system which could not change until a larger shift took place. In fact, for example, Mrs. Thatcher always felt that we would never have any transformation in South Africa until the former East was defeated. And that change, in fact, was held back even at the release of Mandela. She was very, very disappointed that there were the negotiations begun to release Mandela, because it did not fit into the whole containment of the East and the containment and defeat of communism. So what I'm just trying to say is that some of these questions are so complicated and have so many dimensions to them that you can't really comment on all of them in one go, although they kind of bounce through your head all the time. But the readings of Fanon suggest to me that the business of agency just doesn't arrive one day and you don't get landed with the power to be able to do something. There is the production, a very long, painful production of a sense of agency. Whether one can act on it too can take a long, long time. Whether one can act on the sense of agency one has developed over a period. For that to happen, for that kind of knowledge to be produced, it might be a long period of introspective knowledge to be produced, a consciousness to be produced, requires, I think, the conditions of an anti-politics, that one isn't immediately taken up with the agendas, the policies, the slogans, I suppose, in the sense that Renata was pointing out, where it is so easy to identify and produce a kind of pseudo-agency, which leads to apparent action in which one is drawn into a struggle, but without that degree of internal interrogation and questioning and the kind of tussle that I perhaps saw in the readings of Fanon, for example, amongst people in the struggle against apartheid. If someone like, I'll just leave that aside for a moment, but what I would want to say is that anti-politics is about what you were talking about. I can't remember your name, the person from the Courtauld Institute sitting behind, about reticence, about the period in which one, as it were, examines the pros and cons. One is absolutely immersed in understanding that unless one has built a kind of internal resolve and discipline, all other actions will be, I suppose, effective as actions, but they will be actions that have been undertaken on the basis of identifying with an ideology pre-made and given to you. So I suppose anti-politics is about working in extremely difficult situations where one has to produce a knowledge that prizes open a space, and in prizing open that space, all of that takes time. Duration is involved. There is a temporality to it. So I don't see how this question of where does and how one produces agency and how one becomes an agent acting in a particular situation can be separated from the question of anti-politics. You see, I don't see them as separate issues, but I do, and nor do I see it as just an antecedent or a preparatory moment that you are in a period of anti-politics and then one day you will act against the political system. I feel that too is linearizing it a bit too much. There is a kind of involvement which must involve, there is a kind of immersion which must involve a constant self-scrutiny, which is what I see anti-politics about. I don't know if that's come out clearly, probably not. But
partially, I think. I wonder if I can. This is maybe a little bit of a pet question, Paul, and I know I should probably not be allowed to ask a question, but it relates to the idea of political correctness, or what happens to political correctness. I ask that particularly because there's a cynical or a sort of rejectionist position I find here in the Netherlands, but I think that's also wider in Western Europe, about the experience of the 70s, particularly the 80s, of political correctness, which of course included a lot of anti-racist and anti-sexist strategies, as I see it, alongside them. It's often been derided, but I think it's an important question. I do wonder whether 1989 represents a moment where the conditions for political correctness got considerably less hospitable. Yes, or whether, when you're talking about this resurgence of the West, political correctness came or produced, probably in a very different way, anxiety and shame, I think, quite rightly. But they also produced what you talk about in Fanon. They produced responsibility and accountability, I think, at least a sense of that, or ideally could have done. And yet now it seems quite difficult for us to address the question of political correctness and of taking account of the person you're addressing, for instance. There's, for instance, in the Dutch debate, a great desire to speak plainly and straightforwardly without taking into account what that might mean in the mind of the other. And I think political correctness tried to address that question, that what words might produce in the mind of the person being addressed, or the mind of the people being addressed. And I just wondered if you could speculate maybe a little bit on your idea of the resurgence of the West, and whether you see political correctness in the terms I've described as in decline over the last 20 years, or you could respond to that at all.
Right. I mean, I have a big, it's the old joke about if you want to go there, we wouldn't start from here kind of thing. Because I find it a measure of our defeat that we are beginning a conversation about this point, which is a really important point that connects to the question of agency, through the category of political correctness, or in relation to it. And I actually want to refuse that, because nobody in 1989 was talking about political correctness. I remember when I first heard those words in California, and they have a kind of viral character. And I don't know if that goes in the same category as swine flu, but I think that it does pollute the polity, in ways that are really... If you're talking about the morality involved in being able to understand the alterity of the self, and to, heteropathically identify with someone else and endow in the person you engage the same subjectivities, vulnerabilities, appetites that you know from your own limited relationship with yourself. I think I want to defend that, and that's sort of what makes me, a rather anachronistic figure, really, in this conversation, because You know, I was thinking when the conversation was being developing that Renata had said and Sarat had implied that we were totally the wrong people to ask because we didn't see it coming either in South Africa or in the Soviet Empire, and that people like us are always running along behind trying to catch up.
But Paul, nobody saw it coming. I mean, there were people being paid millions of dollars as criminologists in Washington who had absolutely no idea.
Yes, well, actually, I mean, sorry, I think there were people who saw it coming, and there's a very noble and very interesting tradition which is in a sort of, uneasy and tense and difficult relationship with the world of official communism on the one hand, the capitalist world on the other, of commentary on precisely on that. I mean, I remember going to interview C.L.R. James at one point towards the end of his life about the little book that he and Castoriadis and Grace Boggs had written about the Hungarian Revolution, and trying to get him to talk about it. And he wouldn't really, but he did say one thing. He said, "Facing reality," that's the title of the book, "that was the one thing we were never prepared to do," he said. So I think, there is I don't want to call it a Jamesian tradition, but there is what Harry Cleaver calls a tradition of reading Marx politically, which doesn't correspond to these particular problems. And whether or not there were some features of that tradition, I'm thinking here of socialism ou barbarie, I'm thinking of the Forrest Johnson tendency, I'm thinking of a kind of you can argue its provenance through the Dutch Council communists or Luxembourg, or there are ways of thinking about the relationship between anarchism and communism that help you to identify its trajectory. And it's never been economistic, and it's always had a conspicuous faith in the ability of people to resist and to organise, and it predicted those events a long time before. And at the end of James's book Notes on Dialectics, which is the least sort of Stalinist book, the sort of headmaster of Western Marxism wagging his finger, what does he say? He says there's nothing more to organise. Once we've reached this point, organisation as we've known it is at an end. And I think that's, in a sense, to start asking questions about political agency from another era, another vocabulary, is again, it's a measure of our defeat that we ask that question in that way. I'm not a cheerleader for Twitter or these Facebook diplomacy I mentioned from the guy in the World Bank calls it. But I do think that, there are things in that world, and I remember when it struck me, it wasn't in 1989, it was in the Philippines when they brought the government down with the SMS messages. There are things there that we don't anticipate, which we need to think about. And it won't make everything all right, but it will make it different. And so political correctness, well, yes and no. What those people do when they say that they don't want to have to think about your feelings and they want to monopolise the right to be offensive to you is nothing to do with political correctness. It's actually to do with a history of racism in Europe that needs to be identified and given its proper name, even though I know it's a terribly vulgar thing to do.
Thanks, Paul. That's great.
Yes, I think, if I may just add to what Paul says, that of course, the undoing of ideologies, of policies, of agendas, such as political correctness, in which political correctness features as one such agenda, is an extremely important question to pose in terms of anti-politics or in terms of the preparatory that one has to undergo in terms of whether one is simply mouthing politically correct positions or whether one is actually living and acting in ways which realizes and manifests that. If we look at the European right today, they have taken over all the political correct slogans. If we look at the nationalists in England, they are claiming to be the Anglo-Aboriginals who have been genocided. And they are quite alive and well, but they are the genocided. And so the language of political correctness is being used against those constituencies that are now seen as privileged and, as it were, favoured by the governments in power, that they have been subject to this discourse of being helped along through political correctness, whereas the rest have been silent. So now they've, in a very, very rude and abrupt and absolutely maddening and ludicrous way, taken over all the sense of victimage and grievance that everyone moans on about with regard to political correctness, and have styled themselves as those who have been put upon and done down by the immigrants, by the outsiders, and so on. So it seems to me you can play a game on the level of slogans and ideologies, but something has to be transformed in one if one has to actually act. And it's those moments of transformation which are very minor, which often begin with moments of anger in Fanon, or begin with a telephone call in Twitter between people which seem really insignificant, but build up into something. This is a matter of the production of a subjectivity. It is about the production of a sense of agency. And of course, there's a total unpredictability about it. I do feel a lot of these events are unpredictable, but I couldn't square the fact that Renata could see so much of it happening in the micro level, but couldn't see how it could build up to some sort of knowledge about whether things would follow certain paths on the macro level. You couldn't see the Berlin Wall come down, but on an everyday level you can see the mechanisms of denial and evasion and so on.
Yeah, and there was a huge enjoyment in fighting against the communist power, which I sort of miss. You know, it was good times, especially in Yugoslavia, because the regime was not so severe, especially in the 80s when I was studying. You know, it was a huge enjoyment to go to demonstrations. You know, the slight danger that someone might arrest you contributed to that enjoyment. But in regard to political correctness, I just recently learned that something now exists like neurodiversity. You know, like movements to respect people with attention deficit disorder and autism and so on, which I found quite an interesting thing. You know, on the one hand, those things are so marketed by pharmaceutical companies as new disorders, especially now for adults, you know, and then suddenly you have a movement, you know, finally I have an identity.
Maybe to anti-politics.
Yes.
Because, you know, I also belong to this kind of milieu, well, speaking about things like that. And I think that these anti-politics ideas and many related ideas actually emerged out of the unwillingness to accept also kind of choice. That was a choice to be for the Soviet power against it. Yeah? It is also a kind of choice, and it also was kind of sold to us. Yeah, it's maybe only one choice, yeah, that was sold to us, that was choice was there. And I, for example, didn't want to be Soviet power, I didn't want to be against Soviet power. That's all of us, at least in milieu, I was there. And Konrad belonged also to the same milieu. So the idea was to kind of reject this choice itself and deconstruct this opposition and to find a way to be against both and be maybe for both, yeah? and to escape this kind of this kind of paralysis that is produced by them. So I think that if we speak about agency, then agency has something to do with acting. Yeah? That we have to escape a certain kind of paralysis. Yeah? We are mostly in a situation where we have to do, we don't like both options, or even three options, or four options. So it's that paralyzed. So then I would say the agency comes as a possibility if we try and if we succeed in trying to escape this situation of paralysis, situation of fixed optionality, and find a way just to go around it. And I think maybe what Konrad meant, it's to go around it. It's not anti-politics, it's a way to go around the politics that is established, to find just a new way to act it.
Okay. I'm going to take three more questions, two of which are already booked, Okwi and Sarah, and if there's anybody else, and Jalal, then that's it.
I sort of lost my train of thought, but since you've given me the mic, I will make some remarks. I'm really struck, especially in looking at what I consider to be the geography and the economy of 1989. how it seems to me there's a repetition of what I would consider historical narcissism, in which history is what happens in the West and the effects, take place elsewhere. And in this, it seems to me that, perhaps an unintended and yet unacknowledged tension here is the one, between, the former East in relation to communism, and which is completely internal to this former East. There's no outside, there's no relationship to other parts of the world. The effects, the racism and the anti-racism produced within the East itself, the kind of the disappearance of this so-called international solidarity that was part of this place, Africans, Asians, and so on. So there is no recognition in the work of so-called former Eastern intellectuals of this disappearance. And I think this is, for me, a very key aporia in this discussion. And the other unintended and unacknowledged tension is the former West in relation to the post-colonial, in which the post-colonial is completely outside. So the other one is an inversion, it's completely inside, it's internal. And the other one, on the other hand, is outside. The post-colonial is that which is elsewhere. It is not, part of this, larger description. And I'm wondering that in this geography and economy of 89 and the forms of historical narcissism that really, makes us focus only on, what I would call, largely the complex of Westernism. If we are not really repeating, this, kinds of failures to reimagine other domains of struggle and practice and historicity, and whether there's any way any of you can take up this question, because if I were to go back to Sarat's presentation this morning, and the three moments he sets next to each other, and I would like to see them not as one continuous line within 1989, but a kind of contiguous, different relations of affiliation to a particular chronology. That Magistrat de la Terre, The Other Story, and Havana, they each happen in different places around the world. But they are not completely synchronized. They are not coordinated. They are not, based on one central causality in terms of historical responses to, moments of art. And what I would like to really to point out, because I know that the Magistrat de la Terre has been elevated to this kind of signal, paradigmatic moment. I think it's a paradigmatic moment by default, because we mustn't forget what Magistrat de la Terre conceived, or how it conceived of artistic practice, that contemporary artists were those who work in the West. Contemporary arts elsewhere are those who are untainted by contact with the West, the unthought and so on. So here there was a kind of deeply problematic neo-colonial conception of the contemporary, even at this very particular moment in 1989. And here also the question of The Other Story, which you could say, really precedes 89. It just happened to take place in 89. But, its historical formation, rightly is elsewhere. So what we are really dealing with is what I would call heterochronical manifestations. And how do we deal with those heterochronical manifestations if we are going to universalize 89 as this moment of global rupture?
Thank you. Sarah, can we ask? Right behind you, if you could hand it back. Thanks. There we go.
Actually, the Magicien exhibition was designed to celebrate the French Revolution initially, but what I wanted to talk about was just for giving people to think about two figures, Simoniac popes and T.E. Lawrence, because in terms of beliefs in belief, the whole of Christendom was a belief in a belief structure. In the Magicien catalogue, there's Spaniards against cannibals, and they're missionaries. And I think it's very interesting to think, because you all keep saying communism versus capitalism, as though capitalism didn't have this displaced belief structure that was functioning concurrently with it. In fact, by the time you get to 89, the other East pours into the West, or whatever you want to call it, in an already already secular society. I wanted both to talk about the fact that to ignore Christendom in discussions of capitalism is displacing a massively powerful belief system, despite the fact it may be, it may be impacting on both the birth of capitalism and the displacement of communism. And secondly, for me, Fanon's daring is to talk about interracial desire. And I think and all the vocabulary we've heard about Fanon is about responsibility, ideology, politics, and the desire which is involved in colonialism, especially the one-on-one of torture, becomes a very sadomasochistic situation. I mean, there's a whole level of desire which a certain kind of Marxist or post-Marxist vocabulary wishes to evacuate in order to have a potentially purer, not necessarily stronger discussion. I just like to point out that dimension of Fanon which troubles the waters. And even the idea of political correctness troubles those, is a kind of American hygienic way of not talking about deeper problems, I think.
And then Jalal, do you still have a question? Yeah. Jalal, could you make it fairly short? Sorry, just because we're running out, please. Go. Sorry, that was unfair.
Okay. It's actually addressed to Boris. I think on some points we're on the extreme opposites of the spectrum, which in this case it would be generalizing artistic creation to almost everybody, and my tendency is to go in the other direction. And in relation to this notion of changing the past, and by that being some kind of artist, there's a very important line from a Philip K. Dick talk. Actually, it's the title of the talk, maybe I mentioned before. It was given in 1978, I think. How to build a universe that doesn't fall apart 2 days later. And it's very important for me in my thinking and constructing my concepts, and I think it's very important for artists. Because for me, most artists either try to construct a universe, which is what one of the things Nietzsche says about artists, to bestow a universe, a whole world, or the other variety, probably Duchamp and others, disperse a universe. So when you have a whole, you try to disperse it. And I think the more sophisticated artists do both, construct a universe and then disperse the universe. But this universe has to hold for more than 2 days. And if you try to change the past fictionally, like a writer, like Philip K. Dick, you want it to hold for more than 2 days. And I think almost 99.999%, when they invent the past, it falls apart the same second. And so for me, artists are this amazing thing that can construct a universe that, like this one, has been holding on for 13.7 billion years. And I think another part of the specificity, difficulty of doing it is, like this one, it has to be consistent, which I think most of what is being done is not consistent. But at the same time, like this universe, for it to hold, it has to have an impossibility. And we have it here in the singularities of black holes, where all the laws of physics break down. This universe is consistent while having an impossibility. And I think Philip K. Dick, all his life, tackled the issue of universes that fall apart and universes that become paranoid and too consistent. So this is one of the remarks. And the second small remark, because we mentioned contemporary. I think it's very important for artists to take more awareness of what is being done in physics. I think it's very difficult to say contemporary when we know no one of us ever is a contemporary of anything. Because of the speed of light, light coming from here takes time to reach me. This is in the past. The sun is in the past. I am the contemporary of nothing. Everything I see around me is in the past. And in my future writings on this theme, I would say the Messiah would reverse this situation. The Messiah would make us contemporary. We're not. Contemporary museums, museum of contemporary, there's nothing contemporary. Okay.
So thank you very much. Thanks for the questions. Boris, maybe, I know we're getting tired now, so we'll wrap it up fairly quickly, but maybe we could just refer to this idea I mean, in a way, you were talking about whether this idea of the dispersal of the idea of the artist is something which is really a valid concept. And I wonder whether you could talk a little bit about this idea that everyone is an artist from Beuys being translated into Facebook pages.
Well, my first cosmological reaction is the following one. There was a theological tradition, I think, in the 11th and 12th century, and the people thought that God disperses and destroys the universe every minute, or maybe even every second, and then build it again. But it built it again more or less looking the same. Maybe not in the details, but looking the same. So we have completely wrong idea to live in the same universe. It's actually not the place. It's similar, but not the same. It was very important movement, nihilism. And actually the word nihilism, later modern notion, takes its roots in this theological movement. So that's cosmological aspect of that. And speaking about rewriting the past, I simply, empirically look at how art is now working and compare that, for example, to Marinetti and Duchamp and Malevich and all of them. Yeah? So the classical modern art and also neo-modern art, you have this, let us make a break with the past. Let us do something different. Yeah? And now the feeling is like a break with the past, like a look how the past actually was. Yeah? So the idea to break with the past is the same. But the direction of the perspective is completely different. So instead of inventing the future, people actually invent the past, and the future is understood as a fidelity to this past that they had invented. Including also communism. Let us invent communism as it actually truly was, and let us remain faithful to that. So we have a completely different way to deal with time. And that's why I mean contemporary. Yeah, if we speak about contemporary, we have to be able to speak about contemporary in terms of longue durée. Yeah, we have to have some kind of stability, intercontemporaneity, and I think the stability comes from this, as I try to say, from this permanent attempt to redefine the past and to make the present actually the place of such redefinition. Yeah? And that gives our present time certain kind of stability that it lacked in the modernist time. So that was the idea. And of course, everybody makes that in a different way. But what's interesting, using the same means of production. So that we have to do with art scene that looks completely different and heterogeneous and completely uniform in the same way. Which is very paradoxical, but very obvious. Because we have only the possibility to use that, but we use it always in a different way. And it is something, what comes out of it, it's a kind of paradox. And I would say that every ideology also, it's like a relation ideology economics. Yeah. So every ideology is transhistorical. Yeah, it has kind of message. But it presents itself always under specific condition of communication, economical, political condition of the time. So all the ideologies look alike. What's very strange in our time, also all ideological discourses look alike. At the same time, they are not. Yeah? And I think to see this difference as the same as the difference, that a kind of optical training that we all of us, I think, developed here meanwhile, I always would say.
Thank you, Boris. And I think we should leave it there. I think we'll come back to the aporias in Okwi's statement in the days to come, because I think they're very important. But if we pick them up now, we'll be here until 12 o'clock. So I'd just like to thank everybody on the panel and everybody in the room for a wonderful day, and come back tomorrow.